Welcome to The Debate. Today we're taking a slightly different approach. Usually we jump straight into the crossfire of conflicting ideas. Today, however, we are going to treat this session more like an academic seminar. We have two very dense, very different texts on the table. One focuses on the United States, and the other, well, it focuses on the Nordic countries, specifically Scandinavia and Finland.
That's right. And we know many of our listeners are, navigating the world of academic English. So this discussion is really designed with you in mind. We're going to practice some core skills, reading, annotation, and discussion. We're not here to shout political opinions. We're here to analyze the arguments, the evidence, and the vocabulary used in these specific texts.
Exactly. We want to understand the architecture of the arguments. So the first text we'll be dissecting is Prison as Punishment, a Behavior Analytic Evaluation of Incarceration by Apel and Diller. This one looks at the United States model through a very specific lens of behavioral science.
And on the other side, we have The Nordic Carceral System by Brendan Humphreys. This one examines what's often called the Nordic model or Nordic exceptionalism. So you have two different systems and really two very different styles of academic writing.
Okay. So let's start where any good academic analysis starts, with the main claim. When you're reading these complex English texts, if you can't identify the main claim, you're basically lost. In the Apel and Diller text, the authors aren't making a moral argument, they're making a functional one.
Precisely. I actually highlighted their thesis statement pretty early on. Their main claim is that the United States prison system is a failure because it doesn't follow scientific principles of behavior change. They argue that if we view prison as an intervention, something designed to stop crime, it just doesn't work. It ignores the data on how human beings actually learn.
It is a bold stance. Yeah. They're essentially saying the entire system is scientifically illiterate. On the other hand, the Humphreys text has a different main claim. He argues that Nordic penal exceptionalism creates a uniquely humane prison system. But, and this is the crucial part, he claims this system is fragile. It's facing modern challenges that threaten to break it.
So we have one text diagnosing a failure and another text analyzing a success that might be under threat. As I was reading these, I was constantly annotating. That's such a key skill. I wasn't just highlighting, I was writing little tags in the margin, like definition, statistical evidence, and counter-argument.
I did the same thing. It's really the only way to keep track of the author's moves. So let's apply that right now to the first text, the analysis of the U.S. model by Apel and Diller. To understand their argument, you really have to understand the vocabulary. The most important term here is recidivism.
Right. In criminology, recidivism refers to the tendency of a convicted criminal to reoffend. To commit a crime again after being released. The authors use this as their primary metric for failure.
I marked this as statistical evidence in my notes. The text states that in the U.S., approximately 70% of prisoners are rearrested within just 3 years of their release.
70%? If you bought a car that broke down 70% of the time, you'd say the engineering was bad. Apel and Diller argue the engineering of the U.S. prison system is fundamentally bad, and this leads us to their behavior analytic perspective.
This is where the text gets a bit technical. They use the term operant punishment. Now, in casual conversation, punishment just means making someone suffer. But in psychology, operant punishment has a very strict definition. It's a consequence that's intended to reduce the probability of a behavior happening again.
Exactly. And the authors argue that the U.S. legal system fundamentally misunderstands how punishment works in the human brain. For punishment to actually change behavior, to stop someone from committing a crime, two specific factors are required: immediacy and certainty.
Let's break those down because this is really the core of their scientific argument. Immediacy means the consequence has to happen right after the action. Think about touching a hot stove. You burn your hand instantly. You learn not to touch it again. Does the U.S. legal system have immediacy?
Absolutely not. The text points out that there's often this massive delay. You commit a crime, you might get arrested weeks later, then you wait for a trial, and you might not go to prison for a year or even more. The brain struggles to connect the punishment to the action when there's such a long gap. The learning just doesn't happen.
And the second factor is certainty. This refers to the probability of being caught. The text provides evidence that, for many crimes, the likelihood of arrest is actually very, very low. So if a criminal thinks, I probably won't get caught, the threat of prison is almost meaningless.
And this brings us to a concept the authors are actively fighting against. It's this idea of severity or intensity.
Right. This is the common political argument you always hear. We need tougher sentences. We need to lock them up for longer. This is often called deterrence, discouraging an action through fear.
But Abel and Diller argue that the math just doesn't work. They note that increasing the intensity, say giving someone 20 years instead of 10 years, it doesn't significantly deter crime if the certainty is low. If I don't think I'm going to get caught, it really doesn't matter how long the sentence is.
I found their point about alternative reinforcement to be very compelling as well. In behavioral science, you can't just punish bad behavior. You have to reinforce good behavior. You need access to positive things, social bonds, family, meaningful work.
Yes, and the text highlights a specific practice in the U.S. that just destroys those bonds: solitary confinement. I annotated this as a major limitation of the current system. The text notes that at any given time, there are about 80,000 prisoners in solitary confinement in the U.S.
80,000 people? Isolated?
And in solitary, they have zero access to any kind of social reinforcement. The authors argue that this makes it scientifically harder for them to function when they're released. We're essentially conditioning them to fail.
So that's the main claim of the U.S. text. The system relies on severity, but it completely ignores the necessary principles of immediacy, certainty, and reinforcement. Okay, now let's pivot. Let's look at the second text by Brendan Humphreys. This takes us to a completely different part of the world.
The central concept here is Nordic penal exceptionalism. We should probably define that. Penal relates to punishment, and exceptionalism just means being an exception to the rule, being different from the global norm.
The argument is that Scandinavian and Finnish prisons are a major exception to the punitive models we see in the US or the UK. And the text suggests this exceptionalism is rooted in a fundamental philosophical difference.
It contrasts the US model of retribution, which is all about paying for a crime, with the Nordic model of normalization.
Normalization is a fascinating term. The text explains that in Finland and Norway, the punishment is only the deprivation of liberty. You lose your freedom to move around. That's it. You don't lose your other rights.
That is such a critical distinction. The text mentions that prisoners retain the right to vote, the right to education, the right to health care. The goal is to make life inside the prison look as much like life outside as possible.
This leads to the concept of dynamic security. I marked this with a definition annotation. In the U.S., we usually just think of static security.
Right. Static security is walls, bars, handcuffs, cameras. It's all about physical control.
But dynamic security is based on relationships. It relies on communication and interaction between the staff and the inmates.
The text gives some vivid examples that, they almost seem fictional to an American reader. It mentions Halden Prison in Norway. There, guards participate in activities right alongside the inmates. They play sports. They even do yoga together.
And it mentions Kvíabryggja Prison in Iceland. The text notes that prisoners there actually have the keys to their own rooms.
Keys to their own rooms. That's a level of trust that is it's diametrically opposed to the U.S. system described by Apple and Diller.
It sounds pleasant, but as academic readers, we have to look for the outcomes. Does this so-called soft approach actually work, or is it just a nice theory?
Well, according to the data in the text, it works. Humphreys cites a recidivism rate for Norway of around 20%.
Okay, so we have 20% in Norway versus 70% in the U.S. That is a massive gap in effectiveness.
It is. And that brings us to the next stage of our seminar, synthesis. Synthesis means combining ideas from different sources to create a new understanding. We need to compare these approaches not just as prison systems, but as reflections of their societies.
Exactly. You can't just transplant a prison system. Humphreys argues that the Nordic model relies heavily on the welfare state and on egalitarianism.
Egalitarianism, right. The belief in human equality. The society provides a safety net, things like housing, jobs, healthcare. The prison is just one part of a much larger support system.
By contrast, the U.S. model reflects individualism. The Apple and Dealer text argues that successful re-entry requires social support, but the U.S. lacks the social systems to guarantee housing or jobs for ex-convicts.
So the U.S. prisoner is released into a void. The Nordic prisoner is released into a safety net.
We also have to synthesize the economic analysis. This is often where the debate gets pretty complicated. I looked at the cost-benefit data.
Yeah, the numbers are stark. The text notes that the U.S. spends about $37 billion a year on corrections. It's a huge sum.
However, if we look at the cost per prisoner, the story changes. Humphreys notes that Norway spends significantly more per person. It's about $93,000 per prisoner per year. The U.S. spends about $31,000.
That is a difficult statistic for policymakers. The Nordic model is 3 times as expensive per person, at least up front.
But this is where critical thinking comes in. We have to look at the long term. If the recidivism rate is only 20%, you're saving massive amounts of money over time. Those people aren't returning to prison. They're working. They're paying taxes.
Exactly. The U.S. spends less per person, but they have to pay for that same person over and over and over again because they keep returning to jail. It's a difference between a cheap repair that breaks immediately and an expensive repair that lasts a lifetime.
That is a strong argument. However, we're not here to simply praise one side. And this brings us to maybe the most important part of an academic seminar: critical analysis. We have to look for limitations.
I agree. It's easy to romanticize the Nordic model, but Humphreys himself demonstrates intellectual humility. He points out the cracks in the system. He introduces a very specific concept: crimmigration.
Crimmigration. That's a blend of criminal law and immigration, right? That was a new term for me.
Humphreys argues that the exceptional humane treatment in Nordic prisons is often reserved for citizens. He discusses the discrimination against foreign nationals and ethnic minority prisoners.
The text specifically mentions the Roma populations. It notes that these prisoners often don't receive the same welfare benefits or the same dynamic security as native-born prisoners.
They report feeling discriminated against by guards. And this challenges the whole idea of egalitarianism. If the humane system only applies to people who look and speak like the majority, is it truly a humane system, or is it just a privilege for the in-group?
There is also a really controversial development mentioned in the text regarding the exporting of prisoners.
This was quite shocking to read, I have to say. The text details how Denmark has rented prison cells in Kosovo, and Norway has sent prisoners to the Netherlands.
This raises a serious logical problem. I mean, the whole premise of the Nordic model is rehabilitation through proximity to family and community. If you ship a prisoner to a different country thousands of miles away, you're completely cutting those bonds.
Exactly. You are violating the very principle that supposedly makes the system work. It suggests that when the system gets crowded, maybe the high ideals are the first thing to disappear. It's a significant limitation.
Okay, so now let's turn that critical eye back to the U.S. text. What is the limitation of the Apple and Dealer paper?
Well, I think the limitation lies in its scope. The text is very behavioral. It treats humans almost like laboratory subjects, stimulus and response.
I see what you mean. It focuses heavily on the mechanics of punishment, immediacy, certainty, but it pays less attention to the structural issues.
Right. Humphreys talks about the welfare state and equality. Appel and Diller, they mention socioeconomic problems, sure, but they don't focus heavily on structural racism or the deep poverty that drives crime in the U.S. They focus on fixing the behavior of the individual rather than fixing the environment that created the criminal in the first place.
That's a valid critique. One text looks at the mind of the prisoner, the other looks at the society around the prisoner.
And that is exactly why reading them together is so valuable. You get the micro view and the macro view.
We are approaching the end of our seminar, so let's move to the conclusion.
To summarize, we've looked at 2 texts with very different main claims. Appel and Diller view the U.S. system as a failed behavioral intervention. They argue it fails because it lacks certainty and positive reinforcement.
In Humphreys views the Nordic system as a successful, humane social contract, but one that is currently threatened by issues of immigration and outsourcing.
We also practiced some key academic skills today. We identified main claims. We defined technical vocabulary like recidivism, deterrence, and exceptionalism.
And we practice synthesis, looking at the cost-benefit analysis and the cultural context of both systems.
For the students listening, your next step is to read these texts independently. Don't just accept our summary. Look for the evidence yourself. Find the sentences that support your own views.
And look for the gaps. What do the authors miss? Because that is where your own academic writing begins.
Thank you for joining us for this academic session of The Debate.
We hope this helps you in your studies. Goodbye.